When I reached the restaurant that night, the cold had already wrapped itself around the city like an invisible predator, gnawing at every exposed surface and seeping into the bones of anyone left unguarded. I parked the car slowly, as if delaying the inevitable, knowing full well what awaited me inside: the gathering of my husband's family, those in-laws who had never once disguised their disdain for me, or the quiet distance they maintained from our daughter. Yet what I did not expect, what stopped my breath in the moment my eyes caught it, was the small figure curled against the brick wall near the entrance, shivering violently, her thin arms wrapped around herself in a desperate attempt to generate warmth. My daughter, my little girl, left outside like some forgotten thing, her lips blue, her eyes wide with the confusion of a child who cannot fathom why the people closest to her blood would treat her as if she were invisible. I froze for a heartbeat, my hand gripping the handle of my purse so tightly that I could feel the bones in my knuckles strain beneath the skin. The world narrowed to just her, to that fragile body trembling in the winter air. The sound of laughter floated out each time the heavy restaurant door opened to admit another guest. Laughter so loud, so indulgent, that it mocked the silence of my child's suffering. I moved quickly then, the instinct of a mother overtaking every rational calculation. I bent down, my knees striking the icy pavement, and gathered her into my arms. The heat of her body was absent, replaced by the terrifying chill of skin left exposed too long to the elements. She looked at me, eyes glassy, and whispered something too soft for me to catch. It didn't matter what she said. Her presence alone, abandoned in that cold, was a sentence written in cruelty that no words could undo. I lifted her, her small frame feeling lighter than it should have, as though the cold had robbed her of substance. With each breath she took against my neck, I could sense the uneven rhythm, the faint stutter that made me wonder how long she had been left there. Inside, through the tall glass windows, I could see them all. The in-laws gathered around the table near the fire, plates piled high with roasted meats and steaming vegetables, glasses raised in toasts that sparkled under the dim golden light of chandeliers. Their world was warm, loud, filled with abundance and carelessness. And yet here, not 3 feet from that door, my daughter had been discarded like a burden too heavy for them to acknowledge. As I held her tighter, my mind flashed through memories of every subtle insult, every sharp glance that had been directed at me since I first entered this family. They had always viewed me as lesser, unworthy, a shadow at the table rather than a true part of their bloodline. And now, in this act, they had shown their contempt not only for me, but for the very child who bore their name. A cold fury spread through me, a fire that no winter air could extinguish. My daughter whimpered softly, her breath frosting against my cheek, and that single sound became the drumbeat of my resolve. The restaurant door opened again, releasing another burst of warmth and music into the night. People passed by us without pausing, their eyes flicking toward us and away as though unwilling to engage with the sight of a child freezing outside a place of feasting. It struck me then how invisible pain can be to those who do not wish to see it, how cruelty can disguise itself as tradition or preference, when in reality it is nothing but neglect. I rose to my feet, clutching her tightly against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and I knew that whatever happened next would not be borne in silence. The image of the fire crackling inside, of wine glasses clinking and forks scraping against porcelain, stood in stark contrast to the ice clinging to my daughter's hair and the numbness in her small fingers as they clutched the fabric of my coat. That door between us was more than wood and glass. It was the boundary between two worlds, the one where appearances were preserved and indulgence reigned, and the one where truth, raw and undeniable, lived in the eyes of a mother who had just discovered the depth of betrayal. I pushed the door open with my free hand, the heavy weight of it groaning as though resisting my entrance, and a wave of heat enveloped us instantly. The sound of laughter dimmed, and a hush began to ripple across the tables closest to the entrance as faces turned toward me. I stepped inside, carrying the child they had chosen to ignore, and in that moment, I felt the silence tighten around me like a stage curtain rising. Every detail sharpened, the smell of roasted garlic and butter, the faint smoke from the fireplace, the reflection of chandelier light on polished silverware. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the trembling of the girl in my arms, and the knowledge that she had been left to suffer, while these people, who dared to call themselves her family, dined in comfort. I walked forward slowly, deliberately, each step echoing louder than the chatter that had just moments ago filled the air. The warmth of the fire on my face felt almost offensive, as if it mocked the cold I had pulled my daughter from. I held her closer, her breath settling into a fragile rhythm, and I realized this was no longer about enduring their disdain or biting my tongue to maintain peace. It was about something primal, something absolute. The line had been crossed, and nothing could erase the image of my daughter left to freeze outside while her blood relatives toasted inside. I could feel the words forming in my chest, a sentence sharp enough to cut through the facade of civility they so carefully curated. And though I had not yet spoken, the weight of what I carried, the truth embodied in the shivering child against me, had already shattered the illusion of their celebration. That night began with silence and ice, but it would not end that way. It was only the first step, the opening act in a story that would unravel every mask they wore, every lie they told themselves about who they were as a family. I stood in that entrance, the world split between the warmth of their deceit and the chill of my child's suffering, and I knew with unshakable certainty that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The moment I crossed that threshold and carried my daughter into the warmth of the restaurant, it was as if two opposing worlds collided in me, one of fire and one of ice, and the impact left something shattering deep inside my chest. I looked at her face pressed against my shoulder, her cheeks pale and raw from the cold, her small hands gripping desperately at my coat as though she feared being set down again. And it struck me like a blade that no child should ever learn so early what abandonment feels like. A strange silence rippled across the dining hall as the guests closest to the fire turned their heads and saw us, their laughter faltering, the clink of glassware suddenly sounding too sharp in the new hush. My in-laws were seated in the center of it all, their eyes widening not in horror at their own cruelty, but in irritation at the interruption, as though my entrance had been an act of indecency in their carefully choreographed evening. I felt something heavy flood into me then, a current that pulled memories to the surface like debris rising after a storm. Years of sacrifice played out in flashes. The nights I stayed awake with fevers clinging to this very child, while my husband worked late, and his parents sent not even a message of concern. The countless holidays where I swallowed their barbed comments with a polite smile so my daughter could believe in the illusion of family. The compromises I made with myself every time they dismissed my worth, telling myself it was for the greater good. Now, all those years condensed into a single cruel picture. My daughter, shivering outside their feast, her childhood dignity already stained by the knowledge that she was expendable in their eyes. The pain was not the kind that demanded tears. It was slower, heavier, the kind that carves itself into bone and marrow. My throat burned with the weight of unspoken words, but I did not cry, for I knew instinctively that tears would give them the power to call me hysterical, overdramatic, unfit. Instead, I stood there rigid, breathing in the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine, and let the fury take shape beneath the stillness. I thought of how I had trusted my husband when he said his family would eventually accept me, how I had believed him when he promised that time would soften their disapproval, how I had silenced the doubts in my own mind for the sake of keeping the peace. Yet peace had been nothing but a fragile mirage, and in this moment, as I held our daughter in my arms, it crumbled to dust. I remembered the years I had given to this marriage, not merely as a partner, but as a shield, absorbing insult after insult, so my child would not feel the sting of rejection. I had told myself that endurance was strength, that patience was noble, that love required compromise. But what good is compromise when it leaves your child in the cold? What is patience if it means swallowing injustice so often that you forget the taste of dignity? These thoughts coursed through me with each shallow breath my daughter took against my neck. The injustice burned more fiercely because it was not directed solely at me, but at the small, innocent being who had asked nothing but to be loved. The sight of them, my in-laws, flushed with warmth and wine, their clothes immaculate, their plates heavy with food, twisted inside me like a cruel reminder that they never once saw her as one of their own. They had carved invisible boundaries long before this night, treating her as a distant obligation rather than blood, and now those boundaries had taken form in the most literal way possible, A door closed against her while they toasted by the fire. The pain swelled into something larger than grief. It became clarity. I understood in that raw silence that the years of trying to belong had been wasted, that the sacrifices I had made were swallowed by people incapable of valuing them. Yet alongside the sorrow came a sharper resolve, born from the ache of every remembered slight. I thought of the birthdays they skipped, the holidays where they gave her token gifts that spoke more of duty than affection, the way they looked at me as if my presence dimmed the light of their gatherings. I realized this was no accident, no isolated cruelty. It was the culmination of years of quiet dismissal, finally breaking the surface. And in seeing my daughter shiver, I could no longer shield her from the truth. She had been excluded, not by chance, but by design. The recognition of that fact tore at me, because it meant all the nights I whispered reassurances into her ear, telling her she was loved, that she was enough, that family was a circle that would always include her, had been countered by their actions in ways she could now see with her own eyes. The shock of that realization left me hollow for a moment, standing there under their watchful stares, my daughter's fragile weight in my arms. I had thought myself prepared for disdain, for sly remarks, for the usual undercurrents of hostility, but nothing had prepared me for the physical cruelty of them choosing to let her sit in the cold. It was a violation that transcended insults. It was proof that they saw her as disposable, as something they could remove from the warmth of their world without a second thought. And as that truth solidified, the pain sharpened into something crystalline, something I could wield. Inside me, the years of silence and compromise condensed into a single line of resolve. No more. No more pretending. No more swallowing bitterness for the sake of civility. No more protecting their image at the expense of my child's well-being. My heart ached for the wasted years, for the naive belief that endurance would soften their cruelty. But that ache became the foundation of something stronger. I shifted my daughter slightly, pressing her closer to me, and met their stares without flinching. If they wanted to see weakness, they would not find it here. What they had created tonight was not just a moment of pain, but the awakening of something unyielding in me, a truth that would reverberate through every step that followed. And in that stillness, the mother's pain found its voice not in tears or pleas, but in the vow that this moment would not be forgotten, that the injustice written on my daughter's blue lips would mark the beginning of a reckoning none of them would escape. There was a moment as I stood just inside the restaurant doors when the weight of the air itself seemed to divide me from everything I had once believed about family. Behind me was the frozen night, where I had found my daughter abandoned, her small body trembling in the cruel grip of winter, and before me stretched the warm glow of chandeliers, velvet curtains, polished mahogany tables, and the indulgent laughter of people who had chosen to forget her existence for the comfort of their own illusions. The door, now closing with a soft thud behind us, became more than wood and glass. It became a symbol of separation, the threshold between love and neglect, truth and hypocrisy, warmth and cold. I carried her through it as though crossing a border, and with each step into the plush, heated air, I felt the invisible line harden around us. It was the line that declared them safe in their opulence while she had been left to shiver outside like an unwelcome guest. The contrast was suffocating. My skin still burned with the sting of the cold air outside, and I could feel her damp lashes against my neck, her breath thin and uneven. Yet inside all was excess. Glasses brimmed with wine that glowed like jewels in the golden light. Plates were stacked with food steaming fragrantly, and the fire in the great stone hearth roared with such intensity that it painted their faces in a flush of comfort. They sat around the table with an ease that mocked the tremors still running through my daughter's body, their chairs pulled close together as though the world outside, the real world of hunger and frost, did not exist for them. My eyes traced their faces, each expression shifting from feigned surprise to discomfort, to thinly veiled irritation at my intrusion. They were not shocked that she had been left outside. They were only shocked that I had brought her in, that I had dared to carry her presence into their circle of warmth where she had not been invited. It struck me then how many years I had spent standing on thresholds like this one, not always literal doors, but invisible ones, boundaries between what was permitted to me and what was withheld. They had always created spaces where I was tolerated rather than welcomed, where my words were background noise to their judgments, where my daughter was seen as half-blood, never fully theirs. Tonight, the door had simply made physical what had always been present in silence, the rejection, the exclusion, the cruel division of belonging. I felt it sink deeper than anger, this recognition, and it grew roots in me that would not be torn out again. As I stepped further into the dining room, the heat pressed against my skin almost unbearably, and I realized how false it felt, this warmth that came not from love, but from firewood and expensive wine. My daughter stirred faintly against me, her eyes half opening, as though she too could sense the falseness of it. She did not smile to see her relatives or reach for them, as a child might do if she expected comfort. Instead, she buried her face deeper into my coat, seeking only me. That small action became a revelation in itself. She already knew, on some instinctive level, that this room was not her refuge, that no hand would reach out here to draw her closer to the fire. Her world of safety was confined to my arms, and that knowledge tightened around me like a vow I would never again break. I watched my husband's mother glance quickly toward the others, her eyes darting as though searching for a consensus on how to handle my sudden entrance. His father's lips pressed into a line so thin it might as well have been a blade, and one of his sisters shifted uncomfortably in her chair before looking back down at her plate, pretending the spectacle was not happening at all. Their silence was an indictment louder than any words. It said plainly that they knew what had been done, and yet would not own it. They had decided, collectively or not, that my daughter did not deserve the warmth they claimed as their right, and now they would decide again how to deny the truth of it. The realization chilled me more than the wind outside had done. I thought of the countless times I had told myself that my endurance was for the sake of unity, that swallowing insult after insult was noble because it preserved the illusion of family for my daughter. But standing there, I understood that unity built on exclusion is not unity at all. It is a prison where one accepts chains in exchange for scraps of acknowledgement. The door had been their latest chain, a barrier meant to remind us of our place, and in walking through it I shattered the very balance they had worked to maintain. Their eyes told me so, the unease in their shifting postures, the nervous laughter that faltered and died, the silence that fell heavier than the crackle of the fire. The sound of my daughter's small cough broke that silence, and it echoed louder than all their chatter. It reminded them of what they had chosen to ignore. In that moment, I saw clearly that the fire's glow did not belong to us, that the heat of this room had been built upon her suffering, her exclusion, as though she were the cost of their comfort. The thought filled me with a grief so sharp it became steel. This was no longer about winning their approval, no longer about finding a place in their circle. The door had revealed the truth. We had never been part of their circle, and they had no intention of ever letting us in. As I stood there, I realized that the world itself had narrowed into two distinct halves, their side and ours. On theirs lay indulgence, arrogance, the brittle laughter of people who believed themselves untouchable. On ours lay truth, pain, and the strength to endure what they could never imagine. And for the first time, I understood that the strength born of cold and neglect was greater than the hollow comfort of false warmth. The door had not only divided us, it had freed me from the illusion that crossing into their world was ever desirable. My daughter's head rested against me with complete trust, and I knew then that whatever warmth she needed I would provide, no matter the cost, no matter the battle it required. The door between us had closed, but in truth, it had always been there, invisible and heavy. Tonight, it had finally revealed itself, and once seen, it could never again be unseen. And in that revelation, a shift occurred inside me, subtle but irrevocable. The pain of exclusion transformed into clarity, and clarity into resolve. Their world and mine were no longer entwined. From this night forward, every step I took would be guided by the knowledge that I had no need to beg for entry into a room that would gladly leave my child outside in the cold. I carried my daughter deeper into the room, her fragile weight pressing against my chest as though she were the only anchor I had left in a sea of false smiles and unspoken contempt. The warmth of the fire reached us, but it was not a comfort. It was an insult, because I could still feel the remnants of the night air clinging to her skin, the tremors that ran through her bones. My eyes swept the room slowly, deliberately, and every face avoided mine as if looking directly at me would expose their guilt. It was not guilt they feared, though. It was exposure. They were afraid of being caught in the nakedness of their cruelty, afraid that their mask of civility would crack if I forced them to look at what they had done. I did not speak yet, but my silence was heavier than words, and it pressed down on them like the weight of a storm waiting to break. The first to move was my mother-in-law. She shifted in her chair, her jeweled hands tightening around the stem of her wine glass. Her lips parted as if to offer some hollow greeting, but when her eyes met mine, the words died in her throat. I saw the calculation there, the quick scramble to paint over the ugliness of leaving a child outside with a stroke of plausible excuse. She looked away too quickly, her gaze flicking toward my husband, as though passing him the responsibility of dealing with me. But he too sat still, his fork hovering above his plate, his expression suspended between discomfort and denial. It was as though none of them knew who should speak first. None of them wanted to step into the silence I had brought with me. And so, I let the silence grow, let it stretch and darken until it filled the room like smoke. I moved closer to the table, my daughter's head resting against my shoulder, her breath warming the collar of my coat. She was calm now, not because she felt safe in this room, but because she trusted me, and that trust gave me strength. I placed my free hand on the back of an empty chair, my eyes locked on each of them in turn, and though I said nothing, the message was unmistakable. I knew. They knew I knew, and the absence of words became louder than accusation. I let the tension thicken, because I wanted them to feel it, to squirm beneath the weight of their own choices. One of my husband's sisters finally attempted to break the stillness. She laughed softly, a nervous sound that didn't belong in the room, and muttered something about the child wanting fresh air. The absurdity of it burned in me, but I did not reply. I only tilted my head slightly, my expression unchanged, my eyes fixed on her until the nervous smile collapsed under its own weakness. She looked down quickly, her fork clattering against her plate, and I felt a flicker of satisfaction. The first crack in their wall of denial had appeared, not because I shouted, but because I refused to let them escape the weight of what they had done. My husband finally found his voice, but it trembled beneath the thin veil of authority he tried to put on. He asked me quietly why I had come, as though the sight of his daughter in my arms was not reason enough, as though I were the one interrupting peace, rather than carrying evidence of their cruelty into the heart of their celebration. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a calmness that unsettled him more than rage would have. In that look was the silent accusation. You let this happen. You chose them over her. You sat here while she froze outside. His eyes dropped, unable to hold mine, and the silence roared louder still. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the void their words could not bridge. Every snap of wood echoed like a reminder that while they basked in comfort, she had shivered against stone. I adjusted her gently in my arms, letting them see how small she looked, how wrong it was that a child should cling so tightly to her mother in a room full of relatives who pretended not to see. My silence became the confrontation itself, a mirror held up to their faces, forcing them to witness what they had done without the shield of denial. I wanted them to feel the shame of their own inaction, to taste the bitterness of it as surely as my daughter had tasted the bitterness of the cold air. The waiter, oblivious to the storm building in the room, approached with a tray, but the tension was so thick that he hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between us before retreating without a word. Even strangers could feel it, the unnatural divide, the cruelty disguised as family. I did not move to sit, though an empty chair waited. Instead, I remained standing, towering over them with my daughter in my arms, letting them stew in the imbalance of power that my silence had created. For years they had spoken over me, dismissed me, controlled the narrative with sharp remarks and exclusion. Tonight, my refusal to speak turned the tables entirely. They were the ones scrambling for words, and I was the one who needed none. The confrontation lay not in accusations, but in presence. By standing there, by carrying the living evidence of their betrayal into their circle of warmth, I forced them to face what they had tried to hide. My daughter's hair still damp with frost, her cheeks pale, her eyes too tired for such a young child. All of it was more damning than anything I could have shouted. I looked at each of them again, slowly, one by one, until their gazes dropped, their confidence crumbling under the weight of being seen. They had always expected me to be the one who shrank away, who smoothed over tension for the sake of civility. But tonight, I gave them nothing. No excuses, no smiles, no escape. When I finally drew a breath deep enough to steady the pounding in my chest, I knew this was only the beginning. The first silent confrontation had done its work. It had unsettled them, stripped them of the illusion of control, and laid the groundwork for what was to come. The silence I had carried into that room was not weakness, it was power. And in their uneasy shifting, in their downcast eyes and faltering excuses, I saw the truth. They were afraid, not of me alone, but of the reckoning that my silence promised. The silence had stretched to its breaking point, thick and oppressive, a silence that made even the fire's crackle sound too loud, that turned the clinking of cutlery into jarring noise against the gravity of what hung in the air. My daughter stirred faintly in my arms, her head still pressed into the crook of my neck, and I felt the fragile rhythm of her breathing steady just enough to remind me why I was standing here, why this moment mattered more than any polite pretense or carefully preserved mask of civility. They all watched me, pretending to carry on with their meal, but failing, their forks suspended in midair, their glasses untouched. It was as if the entire room had paused, waiting for me to explain myself, to justify my intrusion, to break the tension with some apology for disturbing their evening. But I had no apologies left to give. I had no more patience for their dismissal or their cruelty disguised as indifference. And so, I drew in a breath that seemed to pull every year of sacrifice, every moment of silence, every swallowed insult into my chest, and I spoke. 6 words, no more, each one sharpened by the weight of everything they had done. She was outside. You were inside. The words did not come out as a scream. They did not need to. They slipped into the room like a blade sliding between ribs, quiet and precise, and the effect was immediate. My mother-in-law flinched as though struck, her jeweled hand tightening so hard on her wineglass that it threatened to shatter. My father-in-law's face turned the color of ash, his lips pressed into an even thinner line as he tried to summon the authority he once commanded but found nothing to stand on. My husband's sisters looked at each other quickly, the guilt flaring in their eyes before they turned them down toward their plates, pretending to find comfort in the half-eaten food before them. And my husband sat frozen, his face caught between shame and rage, as though my words had exposed not only their cruelty, but his own complicity in it. She was outside. You were inside. The sentence echoed louder than any accusation could have, because it was undeniable. There were no explanations to soften it, no lies clever enough to erase the truth carried in those 6 words. I had framed the crime in a way that no amount of gaslighting could distort. They had chosen warmth over responsibility, feasting over care, appearances over compassion, and I had carried the evidence into their midst. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was heavier, charged with the sting of exposed shame. My daughter shifted again, her small hands clutching the fabric of my coat, and her presence was the proof they could not ignore. Every tremor of her body, every shallow breath, every strand of hair still damp from the frost, was a reminder that those 6 words were not abstract. They were flesh and blood. My mother-in-law finally attempted to speak, her voice trembling as she muttered something about the child wanting to play, about how children did not feel the cold as adults did. But her excuse fell flat before it left her lips, because the sight of my daughter clinging to me destroyed any pretense of innocence. I did not reply, did not dignify her lie with argument. I only repeated the words again, softer this time, each syllable deliberate, so that they had no choice but to hear them fully. She was outside. You were inside. My husband tried to intervene then, his voice louder, more defensive. He demanded to know why I had come, why I had chosen this night to stir conflict, as though I were the architect of discord rather than the one who had uncovered it. His attempt to redirect the blame was as hollow as the excuses of his family, and I met his gaze steadily, unflinching. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. I only let the words hang there, turning the silence into a mirror they could not look away from. The fire roared louder. The room felt smaller, and their discomfort grew into something almost visible. a shadow that spread across their faces and tightened their throats. For years they had thrived on my silence, on my willingness to endure for the sake of peace. But now, silence was no longer my weakness. It was my weapon. And those 6 words were its first strike. I saw it in the way they shifted, in the way their eyes darted, in the way my husband looked down, unable to meet the gaze of the woman he had once promised to protect. The balance of power had shifted with a single sentence. My daughter's breathing steadied against me, and I felt her trust as something sacred, something worth burning every bridge for. I pressed my lips gently to her hair and closed my eyes for a brief moment, drawing strength from the truth that I had finally spoken aloud. Those 6 words were not the end. They were the beginning, the spark that would ignite the fire to burn away every falsehood and every cruelty that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. Tonight, in this room of golden light and hollow laughter, I had cut through their illusions with nothing more than the truth, and I knew, with unshakable certainty, that they would never be able to escape it. The weight of those 6 words still lingered in the air, their echo spreading across the room like ripples over dark water. My voice had not needed to rise, my tone had not carried anger, yet the very simplicity of the statement had left no room for evasion. I could see it in their faces. Every mask they had so carefully constructed over the years was beginning to crack. My mother-in-law shifted uncomfortably, her jeweled fingers trembling slightly as they hovered around her glass, the crimson wine within trembling with her. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally spoke with a tight smile, her voice trembling, but laced with a desperate attempt at control. She muttered about misunderstandings, about how perhaps the child had wandered outside without anyone noticing, how they would have invited her in had they known. The words were empty, brittle, so fragile against the force of the truth that had been placed before them. I did not reply. My silence forced the lie to hang in the air, exposed, naked in its weakness. My father-in-law's eyes darkened with irritation, his lips curling into something between contempt and defensiveness. He leaned back in his chair, trying to reclaim the dignity that the 6 words had stolen from him, and said coldly that children must learn boundaries, that perhaps it was good for her to understand that not every door would open for her whims. His attempt at authority was sharp, but beneath it I heard the fear, the thinness of a man whose control was being eroded in front of witnesses. The sisters exchanged nervous glances, one of them murmuring that perhaps I was overreacting, that I was tired, emotional, exaggerating what was no doubt a small oversight. Her voice cracked as she said it, betraying the hollowness of her defense. She avoided looking at me, instead staring down at her plate as though the roasted meat and vegetables might offer her a shield. The other sister laughed nervously, a sound so false it made the room colder than the night outside, and mumbled that children liked to play games, that maybe my daughter had enjoyed the thrill of the cold before deciding she wanted to come in. I stared at them both, unblinking, and their voices faltered, fading into silence under the steady weight of my gaze. And then there was my husband. His face was taut, drawn between loyalty to the people seated at that table and the undeniable truth resting in my arms. He began with excuses, half-hearted ones about miscommunication, about how busy everyone was, about how I should not blow this out of proportion. His words, though, rang hollow the moment my daughter stirred against me, releasing a weak cough that seemed to pierce the air more sharply than any argument could. He stopped speaking, his eyes darting to her face, and in that instant the shame settled on him like a cloak too heavy to bear. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and I knew he felt the truth of those 6 words pressing against his chest as surely as I did. The room swelled with tension, the air heavy with the clash between the facade they struggled to uphold and the undeniable reality I had brought into their midst. My daughter's fragile breathing was the metronome of their guilt, and every shift of her small body in my arms deepened the silence that followed their excuses. I realized then that the confrontation had already begun, that every word they spoke only condemned them further, because the more they tried to explain, the more evident it became that no explanation could excuse leaving a child in the cold while they dined in warmth. My mother-in-law tried again, her voice rising slightly, filled with the desperate authority of someone used to commanding the narrative. She said I was being dramatic, that I had always taken things too seriously, that I needed to learn to be more like them, to laugh, to relax, to stop turning small matters into catastrophes. Her attempt at control faltered, though, when I did not react. I stood rooted, holding my daughter tightly, my silence more condemning than any words could be. She searched my face for a crack, for some sign of weakness, but found none, and her own composure fractured under the weight of my stillness. The others began to fidget, pushing food around their plates, sipping wine they no longer tasted. Their eyes darted toward the fire, toward one another, anywhere but toward me. They were desperate to find a rhythm again, to return to the warmth of their feast and the illusion of unity, but the illusion had already collapsed. My daughter's presence had burned it away. She was proof of their cruelty, proof that they valued their comfort above compassion, and no amount of wine or laughter could restore what those 6 words had destroyed. The waiter entered again, hesitating as he sensed the tension. He set down a dish and fled quickly, unwilling to linger in a space that had become poisoned by truths too heavy to ignore. The sound of the door swinging shut behind him was sharp, and it reminded me of the door I had opened earlier, the door between cold and warmth, between cruelty and care. I realized then that this dinner would never recover, that the night had been transformed irreversibly by a confrontation they had not expected, a confrontation they could not escape. Their reactions told me everything I needed to know. Not one of them had reached for my daughter. Not one had shown concern for her health. Not one had apologized sincerely. Their only instinct had been to defend themselves, to preserve their pride, to protect their own image from the truth I carried. And in that realization, something in me hardened further. I had thought that exposing them might spark shame strong enough to ignite compassion, but all I saw was fear, deflection, and irritation. They did not regret what they had done. They regretted being seen. As I stood there, the fire casting shadows across their uneasy faces, I understood that this was not the end of the confrontation, but only the beginning. Their reactions revealed not only their cruelty, but their weakness, their fear of exposure, their reliance on silence to preserve their power. And I knew then that silence was no longer their weapon. It was mine. They could not undo what had been said. They could not erase what had been seen. And every attempt they made to justify themselves only deepened the wound they had carved. I held my daughter closer, her breath steadying now in the warmth of my arms, and I realized with absolute clarity that their reactions had already sealed their fate. They had shown me who they were. They had shown me that they would never change. And in doing so, they had given me the strength to move forward, to take the next step in a journey that would strip away every last pretense they clung to. The weight of their excuses still hung in the air like smoke that clung to the skin and would not wash away, but beneath their muttered justifications and hollow laughter, there was a truth louder than anything they could say. Not one of them had moved toward us. Not one of them had reached out a hand to comfort the child trembling in my arms. Not one of them had thought to rise from their chairs and meet me halfway. Their instinct had been to defend themselves, not to care for her, and in that silence I saw everything I needed to see. I had walked into this room carrying a truth they could not ignore, and their only response was denial, irritation, and fear of being exposed. It was then that I understood with an unshakable clarity that there was no reason to remain in this place, no reason to sit at a table where warmth was purchased at the cost of cruelty, no reason to accept the pretense of family when the reality was rejection. I looked down at my daughter, her small body pressed tightly against mine, her eyes closed now in exhausted trust, and I felt the fragile steadiness of her breath against my collarbone. She did not stir at the sound of their voices because she did not need them. She needed me, and only me. The realization struck me with such force that it seemed to silence the entire room. I did not belong here, and neither did she. We were not guests in this place. We were intrusions, tolerated only so long as we played the role of shadows, silent and obedient. But tonight, the mask had broken, and there was no going back. I adjusted her gently in my arms and straightened my spine, my decision crystallizing like ice that hardens into glass. The fire still roared in the hearth, but it no longer tempted me. Its warmth was false, a warmth that covered only those they deemed worthy. I had carried true warmth with me when I stepped into the night air to gather my child, and I carried it still in the strength of my embrace. They had mistaken comfort for love, indulgence for care, and they had left my daughter outside the door because she did not fit their vision of what belonged. That knowledge tore through me like a blade, but it also freed me. I let my gaze travel around the table slowly, deliberately, pausing on each face long enough that they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My mother-in-law tried to meet my eyes with a brittle smile, but it collapsed under the weight of my silence. My father-in-law leaned back, his authority eroded, his jaw clenched in frustration he could not voice without betraying the guilt underneath. The sisters lowered their eyes, pretending fascination with their plates, while my husband sat stiff, his knuckles white around his fork, his entire posture speaking of a man caught between two worlds but unwilling to choose. And in that moment, I realized he already had chosen. His silence was his answer. The decision not to stay came to me not as an impulse, but as inevitability. It was not anger that guided me, though anger pulsed hot and sharp beneath my ribs. It was clarity. To remain at this table would be to accept their terms, to accept that my daughter could be left outside in the cold while they feasted, to accept that my presence was a disruption rather than a rightful belonging. To stay would be to agree to silence, to bow once again to their control, and I was done with silence. I was done with compromise that demanded my child's dignity as its price. I shifted my weight slightly, preparing to turn, and the room seemed to sense the finality in my movement. My mother-in-law spoke quickly then, her voice higher, almost pleading, though still wrapped in arrogance. She said it would be rude to leave, that the child was fine now, that I should sit and join them, that we could all pretend nothing had happened. Her words spilled like syrup over rot, sweetened but sour at their core, and I felt a sharp, cold certainty as I shook my head once. Slowly, deliberately, I would not pretend. I would not play along in their theater of lies. My father-in-law bristled, muttering something about respect, about how I should know my place, about how walking out would be a grave insult to the family name. His voice was sharp, meant to wound, but it only revealed his fear. He did not fear my leaving. He feared what it meant, the fracture it represented, the exposure it carried. I let his words pass without acknowledgement, because they no longer mattered. His authority had no hold over me, not after tonight. My husband's voice broke the silence next, quieter than the others, but his words cut deeper because of what they revealed. He said we should stay, that it was easier that way, that there was no point in making a scene. Easier. The word lodged in me like a shard of ice. Easier for whom? Easier for him to sit in comfort while his daughter had been left outside? Easier for him to close his eyes to the cruelty of his family so he could maintain his fragile place at their table? Easier for him to betray the trust of the child who bore his name? I looked at him, long and hard, and though he tried to hold my gaze, he faltered. He looked away, and in that small gesture, I saw the truth. He had chosen ease over truth, appearances over love, and in choosing them, he had lost us. I drew in a breath that seemed to settle the room, and then, without raising my voice, I said quietly but firmly, "We will not stay." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of finality, the closing of a door that had always been open only on their terms. My daughter stirred faintly at the sound of my voice, her small hand clutching the fabric of my coat, and I felt her trust like a promise binding me to my choice. I turned then, slowly, each step deliberate as the fire's warmth faded behind me, and the chill of the night beckoned. But the cold outside no longer frightened me, because I knew that the warmth I carried in my arms was stronger than anything that fire could provide. The silence followed me as I crossed the room, the weight of their eyes pressing against my back. They did not stop me, though I could feel the tension in their stillness, the panic of people who realized too late that the balance they had relied on had shifted beyond repair. I reached the door, pushed it open with one hand, and felt the night air rush in again, sharp and pure, cleansing the suffocation of that room. The cold wrapped around us, but it was honest, and in its honesty, I found strength. As the door closed behind me, I understood that the decision not to stay was not only a rejection of their cruelty, but an affirmation of something greater. It was the recognition that family is not defined by blood or by the seats at a table, but by the arms that hold you when the world grows cold. And as I walked into the night, carrying my daughter, her head resting against me in unshakable trust, I knew with absolute certainty that we had left more than a dinner behind. We had left behind the illusion of belonging, the chains of silence, the false warmth of their fire. What remained was the truth, and in truth, there was freedom. The door had closed behind me with the weight of a final verdict, and the cold night rushed over us in a way that felt almost liberating. The air bit at my skin, but it was an honest bite, free of deception, unlike the suffocating warmth I had just abandoned. My daughter stirred slightly against my chest, her face pressed into the hollow of my neck, as if she knew instinctively that we were leaving the danger behind. I walked to the edge of the sidewalk, my breath fogging in the air, and for a moment, I thought I would not hear the sound of the door again, but then it opened, and I knew before turning who it was. His footsteps were slower than they should have been, hesitant, dragging as though the very act of leaving that table cost him more than the cruelty of what had just occurred. My husband emerged into the cold, his coat hastily thrown over his shoulders, his expression a mixture of irritation, fear, and a softness he wore only when he thought it might work on me. He stood there for a moment, watching me with the weight of someone torn in two, caught between the comfort of the fire behind him and the undeniable truth in front of him. His breath came out in clouds, and for the first time all night, there was no audience to perform for. It was just us, the frozen air, and the silence heavy with everything left unsaid. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but I could already hear the words he wanted to use. Compromise, misunderstanding, easier this way. Words that were meant to stitch over wounds without ever cleaning them. Words that had become his shield whenever conflict threatened the fragile peace he tried to preserve with his family. But tonight, those words would not hold. Tonight, I was not going to accept them. I turned slightly so he could see her face, pale and still marked by the cold, her small hand curled into the fabric of my coat. The sight of her silenced him before he could begin. He looked at her, then at me, and I watched the conflict rage in his eyes. He wanted to defend them, to explain away what had happened as some accident, some oversight. But he also knew, perhaps for the first time with true clarity, that he had stood on the wrong side of the door, that he had chosen silence when he should have chosen to protect. His hesitation betrayed him. Every second he lingered in indecision, told me where his loyalty truly rested. Not with us, not with the child whose trust had been betrayed, but with the fragile structure of belonging his parents offered him. He finally spoke, his voice strained, pleading. He said we could not make a scene, that leaving like this would create fractures that could never be mended, that our daughter was fine now, and we could just return to the table and move forward. Move forward. The words stung because they revealed the truth I had always known but never wanted to face. He did not want resolution. He wanted silence. He did not want justice. He wanted convenience. He did not see the cruelty for what it was. He saw only the inconvenience of my refusal to endure it quietly. I let him speak, his words tumbling into the night air, and I watched him as I had never watched him before. I saw the boy still desperate for approval from his parents, the man who had never fully cut the cord of their control, the father who had not yet learned that love is measured in choices, not in appearances. I saw in him the weakness I had shielded myself from acknowledging for years, hoping that one day he would stand firmly by my side. But tonight he had shown me clearly that he could not stand on both sides of the line forever. The door had divided us, and his choice had been made the moment he stayed seated while our daughter froze outside. He reached out a hand, as though to touch her, but his hand faltered halfway, hanging in the space between us, uncertain. I stepped back, a small but decisive movement, and his hand dropped. His eyes flickered with hurt, but beneath it was anger, the anger of a man unaccustomed to losing control of the narrative. He began to raise his voice then, accusing me of dramatizing, of twisting the situation into something it was not. But the sound of our daughter coughing softly against my shoulder cut through his words and left him exposed. He fell silent again, staring at her, and I knew in that instant that nothing he said could change what had already been written in the frost of her lips, in the tremor of her hands. The cold seeped into us, but I did not move toward the car yet. I wanted him to feel this moment, to stand in the freezing air and face the truth without the shield of firelight or the comfort of his parents' approving nods. I wanted him to understand that he was not caught between two sides by accident. He had placed himself there by choice, by refusing to stand fully with us when it mattered most. And now, as he shifted uneasily from one foot to the other, I realized that his indecision was not a flaw to be corrected, but a reality to be accepted. He would always hesitate. He would always falter. And in that hesitation lay betrayal. I told him quietly that we were leaving. Not just the restaurant, but the pretense that this family was ours. He tried to argue, to insist that we could talk later, that we could fix it, that there was still a way to keep both worlds intact. But I shook my head, and the look in my eyes must have told him more than words ever could, because he stopped. He lowered his gaze, and for the first time, I saw him not as my husband, but as a man who had chosen the easier path at the cost of his child. The weight of that truth pressed heavily between us, more suffocating than the cold. I turned toward the car, my daughter still nestled against me, her small breaths warming the hollow of my neck. He did not follow immediately. He lingered, torn, looking back toward the glowing windows of the restaurant where laughter had begun to rise again as if nothing had happened, then forward to where I walked away with the child he was meant to protect. In that pause, I knew everything. He belonged to them more than he belonged to us, and though he might chase after me later, though he might beg for forgiveness, the truth of tonight would always remain. When the line was drawn, he did not cross it to stand with us. The night closed around me as I opened the car door and placed my daughter gently inside, wrapping her in the blanket I had left in the back seat. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting mine with a trust that broke and healed me at once, and I whispered to her that she was safe now, that she would never again be left in the cold. Behind me, I heard his footsteps approach, slower now, uncertain. He stood at the car as though he belonged there, as though proximity might absolve him of the choice he had made. But I did not look at him. I focused only on her, on the warmth I could give her, on the promise I would keep. And in that silence, heavy with the weight of everything left unspoken, I realized that the man I had married would always live between two sides, but I no longer had to. My choice had been made the moment I lifted my daughter from the cold ground outside the restaurant. His choice had been made the moment he stayed seated inside. The door had divided us, and no matter what words he tried to weave in the days to come, the truth of that division would never fade. The night after the restaurant lay over me like a heavy shroud, not because of the cold that clung to my skin, but because of the weight of everything that had been revealed. When I closed the car door and saw my daughter cocooned in the blanket, her small body finally beginning to rest without trembling, I knew with unshakable clarity that the life we had lived until now, the careful balancing act, the swallowing of insults, the pretended harmony, was gone. The line had been drawn too clearly to ignore, and my husband's hesitation at the threshold had sealed it. He had shown me who he was, who his family was, and who they would always be. There was no going back. And with that realization came a different kind of resolve, one not born of rage but of necessity. There would be consequences, not only spoken truths, but concrete fractures that would change the shape of our lives forever. In the days that followed, I moved with a quiet determination that unsettled him more than anger would have. He expected shouting, tears, accusations that could be dismissed as hysteria, but I gave him none of that. I gave him silence sharpened into purpose. While he tried to smooth things over with late-night explanations and murmured apologies, I collected every piece of evidence I needed: messages, photographs, receipts, proof of the pattern of exclusion and neglect that stretched far beyond one night. I was no longer interested in convincing him or his family of their cruelty. I was interested in ensuring that my daughter would never again be subjected to it. The first consequence came in the form of a letter, drafted with care and precision, addressed to the school board where his father still sat as a respected member. In it, I detailed the treatment my daughter had endured, not framed as an emotional outburst, but as a matter of safety and welfare. I included the photographs of that night, the faint frost still visible in her hair when we returned home, the receipt from the restaurant timed exactly to when she was outside alone, the names of those who had been present inside. It was not vengeance, it was protection. A man who could leave his own granddaughter outside in the cold had no business making decisions about children's well-being. The truth was sharp, and when revealed to the right audience, it cut through the illusions of reputation his family had hidden behind for years. The second consequence was financial, and it struck where they felt most secure. I had quietly managed the household accounts for years, balancing budgets, paying bills, handling the things my husband considered beneath him. In that silence, I had learned more than he ever realized. I knew which investments bore his parents' names, which accounts they funneled money through, which properties they claimed as symbols of their superiority, and I knew, too, the leverage I had as his wife, as the mother of their only grandchild, as the one whose signature appeared on more documents than they would ever admit. When I froze those accounts temporarily, citing irregularities that required investigation, the panic it caused reverberated through their gilded walls louder than any confrontation ever could. But the most significant consequence was personal, and it came in the form of a boundary so unyielding that it frightened even me. I told him, in words as steady as stone, that our daughter would have no further contact with them. No visits, no dinners, no holidays spent in false cheer under chandeliers that glowed while her spirit was crushed. He tried to argue, tried to remind me of tradition, of appearances, of how children needed extended family, but I met his protests with the truth he could not escape. Family is not defined by blood, but by the warmth of care, and they had proven beyond doubt that they possessed none. She would not be left in their care again, not for an hour, not for a moment. That door was closed, and I held the key. He begged then, not for her sake, but for his, because the fracture threatened the image he had clung to his whole life, the image of belonging to a family whose name meant power in their small corner of the world. He pleaded late into the night, his words tumbling over themselves, but the more he spoke, the more I saw the truth of him. He was afraid not of losing us, but of losing them, of being cast out from the warmth of their fire even though it was false. He had always been theirs before he was ours, and now that choice stood in the light where he could not deny it. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply told him that if he wished to remain with them, he could do so freely, but he would do so without us. And in that ultimatum lay the final blow, not a threat, but a fact. Because he knew as well as I did that what had happened at the restaurant was not an isolated cruelty. It was a culmination of years of disdain, of dismissal, of calculated exclusion. To return to them now would be to choose them fully, to sever the bond he claimed to have with us. The choice was his, but the consequence was mine to enforce. The days stretched long, each one filled with his attempts to negotiate, to smooth, to find a compromise where none existed. But my resolve was iron, and every time he wavered, every time he hesitated, the truth grew sharper. I would not stay in the cold of their indifference, and I would not allow my daughter to learn that her worth could be measured by their approval. The consequences had already taken root, and like cracks in marble, they spread outward, unstoppable, until the entire structure of our lives as we had known them fractured beyond repair. What began with 6 words inside a restaurant had become a reckoning written into every part of our lives. Their reputations faltered, their finances strained, their control broken, and in the center of it all was the simple, undeniable truth. They had left her outside, and I had brought her in. And for that, there could be no forgiveness, only consequence. The final days of that winter stretched long and heavy, as though the season itself wished to remind me of the cold I had carried my daughter out of, the cold that had revealed more truth in one night than years of silence ever had. Yet as the snow gathered on the eaves of our house, and the winds pressed against the windows, something within me had shifted irreversibly. For the first time in years, I did not live bent toward appeasement, did not wake with the weight of trying to maintain a peace that had never been real. Instead, I woke each morning to the sound of my daughter's breathing steady beside me, to the warmth of her small hand finding mine as though to confirm that I was still there, still her shield, still her home. That was the warmth that mattered, not the firelight in gilded rooms, not the approval of those who had left her shivering outside. The consequences I had set in motion rolled forward quietly, as steady and inevitable as tides. The school board meeting where my father-in-law had once held sway now echoed with murmurs of doubt about his judgment, questions raised not by my voice alone, but by the evidence that spoke louder than any plea could. The financial disruptions I had triggered rippled into their lives, exposing how fragile their fortress of wealth truly was when someone dared to tug at the carefully woven seams. They tried, of course, to paint me as vindictive, to whisper in corners that I was unstable, emotional, bitter. But their words, for the first time, found no traction, because the truth had been witnessed. People had seen, people had heard, and above all, people knew that no child deserved to be left in the cold. Their reputations bent under the weight of that truth, not because I shouted, but because I had carried silence like a blade and used it where it cut deepest. As for my husband, the man who had lingered too long between two sides, his days became marked by his own indecision. He wandered through the house, as though it belonged to someone else, speaking less and less, unable to reconcile the choice he had already made with the reality it carried. He tried, in small ways, to reclaim the trust he had lost, making gestures of care that came too late, offering words of regret that carried no weight. My daughter no longer looked to him with the unquestioning trust she once had. Children see more than we admit, and she had seen his hesitation when it mattered most. She clung to me now, and though it broke me to witness the fracture of what should have been her father's bond, I knew that her heart had recognized the truth. He had not chosen her when the line was drawn. I did not live for vengeance, though it had passed through me like fire in the beginning. I lived now for freedom, for the quiet dignity of knowing that I no longer needed their approval, that I no longer had to measure myself against their standards, that I no longer had to sit at tables where my daughter's worth was questioned. We began to build something new, not grand or gilded, but real. Simple dinners at our own table, laughter that did not hide barbs, warmth that came not from firewood but from love. Each night, as I tucked her into bed and felt her hand relax in mine, I understood that this was what family meant: presence, constancy, the refusal to abandon. There were moments still, when doubt crept in like a draft beneath the door, moments when I wondered if I had done the right thing by severing ties so completely, moments when I worried about the future I had carved out on our own. But then I remembered the sight of her outside that restaurant, her small frame hunched against the wind, her lips blue, her eyes searching for someone who cared. And I knew that every step I had taken since was not only right, but necessary. That image was a scar I carried, but it was also a compass, always pointing me back to the truth of what mattered most. Spring eventually came, as it always does, and with it came the softening of the world. The snow melted into streams that carved through the earth, and blossoms broke through the soil, as though reminding me that even after the harshest winters, life insists on returning. I watched my daughter run in the yard, her laughter carrying on the wind, her cheeks pink, not with cold, but with joy. And I realized that we had found a warmth that could not be taken from us. It was not given by them, and so it could not be stolen. It lived in us, in the bond we shared, in the strength born from a night that should have broken us, but instead had made us whole. The fire in that restaurant had been theirs, flickering against stone walls, feeding on wood that turned to ash. Our fire was different. It lived in the quiet courage of choosing to walk away, in the trust of a child who knew she would never be left again, in the steady heartbeat of a mother who had finally learned that survival was not enough, dignity was required. That was the warmth we carried forward, into every day, into every choice, into every moment of the life we began to rebuild together. And when I think back to that night, to the door that separated cold from warmth, cruelty from care, I no longer see it as the end of something. I see it as the beginning. For in stepping through it, I left behind a world that had never truly been mine, and I stepped into the only one that mattered, the world I created with her, where love was not conditional, where warmth was not rationed, where belonging was not earned but inherent. That was the final truth, the one they could never take from me, the warmth that was ours.